The dust clouds on the horizon held no mercy as Nora Newman stumbled along the dried-up creek bed, her swollen belly heavy beneath her tattered wedding dress, the hem now stained with the red dust of the Arizona Territory. It was 1878, and she was 18 years old, a widow before she'd even been properly a wife. Sweat trickled down her face as she clutched her stomach, another sharp pain causing her to gasp. The baby wasn't due for weeks yet, but the strain of her journey, the grief of losing Thomas, and the merciless heat had taken their toll. The settlement of Silver Creek was still miles away, and Nora knew with growing certainty that she wouldn't make it. Her legs gave way beneath her, the world tilting as she collapsed onto the parched earth, one arm protective around her unborn child, the other breaking her fall. The sound of hoofbeats registered dimly in her fading consciousness, approaching fast, then stopping. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, she glimpsed a tall figure dismounting, the silhouette of a wide-brimmed hat against the brutal sun. "Madam, madam, can you hear me?" The voice was deep, concerned, as strong hands gently turned her over. Nora's eyes fluttered open to see a weathered face, kind eyes squinting down at her with concern. "My baby," she whispered, her hand still cradling her belly. Without hesitation, the stranger scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, cradling both her and her unborn child against his chest. "I've got you both," he said, his voice steady as he lifted her onto his horse. "Name's Flynn Barton, and I ain't looking back until you're safe." The journey to Flynn's homestead passed in a blur of pain and half-consciousness for Nora. She was vaguely aware of his strong arms holding her secure against the rocking motion of the horse, of his quiet reassurances whenever she moaned in pain, of the surprising gentleness in his calloused hands. "Stay with me, madam," he kept saying. "Not much further now." When they finally arrived at a modest cabin nestled against a stand of cottonwoods, Flynn carried her inside and laid her on a simple bed. "Mrs. Holloway," he called out. "Need your help urgently." An older woman appeared from the adjacent room, her gray hair escaping from a tight bun. Her eyes widened at the sight of Nora. "Good Lord, Flynn, who's this poor creature?" Found her collapsed by Sawyer's Creek. "She's with child and in a bad way." Mrs. Holloway's experienced hands examined Nora quickly. "The baby's coming early. Flynn, fetch water and clean linens." "Then make yourself scarce." Flynn nodded, squeezing Nora's hand briefly before disappearing to do as instructed. The next hours were a blur of pain unlike anything Nora had ever experienced. Mrs. Holloway proved to be skilled and efficient, coaching her through the ordeal with firm kindness. Outside, Nora could hear Flynn pacing, his boots striking the wooden porch in a steady rhythm. As the sun began to set, painting the small room in golden light, Nora's daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that belied her early arrival and small size. "You've got a fighter here," Mrs. Holloway said approvingly as she cleaned and swaddled the infant. "She's tiny but strong." Nora wept as the bundle was placed in her arms. "Hello, my little Sarah," she whispered, the name she and Thomas had chosen coming naturally to her lips. Mrs. Holloway stepped outside, and moments later Flynn entered cautiously, hat in hand, his tall frame seeming too large for the modest room. "Madam," he said softly, "I'm glad to see you both well." Nora looked up at him, truly seeing him clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 25, with sun-bronzed skin, dark hair, and eyes the color of the sky after a storm. His clothes were worn but clean, and there was an earnestness to his expression that touched her. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved us both." Flynn shuffled his feet, embarrassed by her gratitude. "Anybody would have done the same, but they didn't. You did." She adjusted the baby in her arms. "I'm Nora Newman. Pleased to meet you proper, Mrs. Newman." "Miss," she corrected, and seeing his confusion, added, "I was on my way to marry Thomas when raiders attacked our wagon train. He didn't survive." Flynn's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Newman. Please call me Nora." The cabin belonged to Flynn, she learned. Mrs. Holloway was his housekeeper, coming in from her own place in town 3 times a week to cook and clean. Flynn had built the place himself after returning from fighting in the war, determined to make something of the land his father had left him. "It ain't much," he said apologetically as he showed her around the next day when she was able to stand, little Sarah sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle he'd fashioned from a wooden crate. "But it's solid and it's mine." The cabin was indeed modest 2 rooms, simply furnished but meticulously maintained. Through the window, Nora could see a small corral with 3 horses, a vegetable garden, and the beginnings of what looked like a barn. "It's wonderful," she said sincerely. "You've built all this yourself." Flynn nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. "Been at it 3 years now, raising horses mainly, got a contract with the cavalry to supply mounts." Mrs. Holloway bustled in with a tray. "You need to rest, Miss Newman. Dr. Simmons will be by tomorrow to check on you and the little one." "I couldn't impose," Nora began, but Flynn cut her off gently. "You're not imposing. You'll stay until you're strong enough to travel, and that's final." As the days passed, Nora regained her strength. Dr. Simmons pronounced both her and Sarah to be doing remarkably well, though he advised against travel for at least 3 weeks. Flynn insisted she stay as long as necessary, sleeping in the barn himself to give her privacy. Each morning, Nora would wake to find fresh wildflowers in a jar beside her bed. Flynn never mentioned them, but she knew they were from him. Little by little, she found herself looking forward to his company in the evenings when they would sit on the porch, Sarah sleeping in her arms, while Flynn told stories of his horses or life before the war. 2 weeks after her arrival, as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Nora finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why did you help me, Flynn? Most men would have left a strange woman to fend for herself." Flynn was quiet for a long moment, absently whittling a piece of wood, a toy horse for Sarah, she realized. "My ma died having me," he finally said. "Pa told me no one stopped to help her when she needed it most. Promised myself I'd never be the kind of man who'd pass by someone in trouble." Nora studied his profile in the fading light, seeing the strength and gentleness there. "Your father raised a good man." Flynn's ears reddened at the compliment. "He tried his best." That night, as she nursed Sarah in the quiet of the cabin, Nora acknowledged to herself what she'd been trying to deny. She was falling in love with Flynn Barton. The realization terrified her. She had lost Thomas so recently, and her heart was still raw with grief. Moreover, she had Sarah to consider now and no means to support herself. The next morning, Flynn found her packing her few belongings. "What are you doing?" he asked, confusion evident in his voice. "We've imposed on your kindness long enough," Nora said, not meeting his eyes. "Sarah and I will go to Silver Creek as I originally planned." "And do what?" Flynn's voice had an edge to it she hadn't heard before. "You don't know anyone there, you have no money, no job. I'll find work, I can sew, cook, Nora." The way he said her name made her pause. "Please don't go." She finally looked at him. "Flynn, I can't stay here indefinitely." "Why not?" His eyes held hers, sincere and direct. "I've grown fond of having you and Sarah here. The place feels right with you in it." Nora's heart leaped, but caution held her back. "People will talk." Flynn ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Let them. I don't care what folks say." "But I do. I have Sarah to think about. What kind of life would she have with people whispering about her mother?" Flynn stepped closer. "Then marry me." The proposal, blurted out without preamble, took both of them by surprise. Flynn looked as shocked as she felt, but he didn't back down. "I know it's sudden," he continued, his voice softer now, "and I know you're still mourning Thomas. I'm not asking for, well, for everything a husband might expect, but I can offer you and Sarah protection, a home, security." "A marriage of convenience?" Nora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Flynn's expression was complicated hope, resignation, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. "Call it what you will, but I promise I'll be good to you both." Nora looked down at Sarah, sleeping peacefully in her cradle. The practical part of her recognized the sense in what Flynn was offering. The emotional part was more confused. "I need time to think," she said finally. Flynn nodded, relief evident that she hadn't outright refused. "Take all the time you need." Later that day, Mrs. Holloway found Nora sitting under the cottonwoods, deep in thought. "He asked you to marry him, didn't he?" the older woman said without preamble, settling beside her on the bench. Nora looked at her in surprise. "How did you know?" Mrs. Holloway chuckled. "I've known that boy since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, seen the way he looks at you when you're not watching, like you hung the moon and stars." "I barely know him," Nora protested. "Sometimes time doesn't matter as much as we think. My Henry proposed after knowing me 1 week. We had 42 good years together before he passed." Nora absently stroked Sarah's cheek as the baby nursed. "I was going to marry a man I'd known my whole life, and then he was gone in an instant." Mrs. Holloway nodded sadly. "Life gives no guarantees, child, but I will tell you this: Flynn Barton is the finest man in these parts, kind to his core, honest as the day is long, and stubborn as a mule when he sets his mind to something." She patted Nora's hand. "And he set his mind on you and this little one." That evening, when Flynn returned from tending the horses, Nora was waiting on the porch, Sarah sleeping in her arms. "I've been thinking about your proposal," she said as he sat beside her. Flynn nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "And?" "I can't offer you love, not yet," she said honestly. "But I can offer respect, partnership, and the possibility that my heart might open again someday." Hope flickered in Flynn's eyes. "Is that a yes?" Nora took a deep breath. "Yes, I'll marry you, Flynn Barton, for Sarah's sake and for mine." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after a long night. Without thinking, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against her forehead, a chaste, tender gesture that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through her. "I'll be a good husband to you, Nora," he promised. "And a father to Sarah, if you'll let me." They were married 2 days later in Silver Creek's small church, with Mrs. Holloway and Dr. Simmons as witnesses. Nora wore a simple blue dress Mrs. Holloway had altered for her, and Flynn looked uncomfortable but handsome in his Sunday best. Sarah, dressed in a gown Flynn had ridden 20 miles to purchase, slept through the entire ceremony. Life settled into a rhythm after that. Flynn was true to his word, treating Nora with respect and Sarah as if she were his own. He built a proper cradle for the baby, expanded the vegetable garden, and began construction on a second bedroom, insisting that Nora keep the main room while he continued sleeping in the barn. "You don't have to do that," Nora told him one evening as they sat on the porch, Sarah cooing in her cradle between them. "It's your home," Flynn shrugged. "I gave you my word, no expectations." Nora studied his profile in the lamplight. What if I've changed my mind about those expectations?" Flynn turned to her, surprise and something else, hope perhaps, in his eyes. "Nora," she felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm not saying, that is, I'm still not ready for everything. But it seems foolish for you to sleep in the barn when there's room enough for us both inside. We are married, after all." That night, for the first time, they shared the same room, Flynn making up a bedroll on the floor beside her bed. It was a small step, but a significant one. As spring turned to summer, their relationship slowly deepened. Flynn taught Nora to ride, laughing with delight at her initial clumsiness and praising her progress. She, in turn, expanded their garden and taught him to make his mother's apple pie from the small orchard on the property. Sarah grew stronger each day, her personality emerging stubborn and sweet by turns, with a smile that wrapped both adults firmly around her tiny fingers. Flynn doted on her, carrying her around the property on his shoulders, singing old cavalry songs to her when she fussed, and crafting increasingly elaborate toys for her amusement. "She looks at you like you hung the moon," Nora commented one day as she watched Flynn gently bouncing Sarah on his knee, the baby's laughter filling the cabin. "That's because her pa is the handsomest fella in the territory," he replied with a wink, then froze, realizing what he'd said. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it's all right," Nora interrupted softly. You are her father now, in all the ways that matter. Something shifted between them after that, a new ease, a growing tenderness. Flynn still slept on the floor, but now Nora would often reach down in the night to hold his hand as they talked in the darkness, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. July brought a heat wave that tested everyone's patience. The creek running through Flynn's property slowed to a trickle, the garden wilted despite their best efforts, and the horses grew irritable in the relentless sun. Inside the cabin, the air was thick and still, making sleep nearly impossible. One particularly sweltering night, after putting an equally heat-frustrated Sarah to bed, Nora suggested they sleep outside. They dragged bedrolls onto the porch, hoping to catch whatever meager breeze might pass. As they lay side by side, watching stars appear in the vast sky, Flynn's hand found hers. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For saying yes. For giving me a chance. For making this place a home." Nora turned to look at him, his profile silver in the moonlight. "I should be thanking you." "You saved us." Flynn shook his head. "It was the other way around, Nora. I was just existing before. Now I'm living." Something unfurled in Nora's chest, a warm, expanding feeling that both terrified and exhilarated her. Without overthinking, she leaned over and pressed her lips to his. Flynn froze for an instant, then responded with such gentle reverence that tears sprang to her eyes. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the first moment I saw you," he admitted. "Even covered in dust and about to deliver a baby," she teased. "Especially then. You were the bravest thing I'd ever seen." They moved their bedrolls closer together after that, falling asleep with hands entwined, a new understanding between them. The change in their relationship was subtle at first, lingering touches as they passed each other, stolen kisses while Sarah napped, long conversations that lasted deep into the night. Flynn remained respectful of her boundaries, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. "I love you, Nora Barton," he told her one evening as they sat watching the sunset, Sarah sleeping against his chest. "I think I have since I first laid eyes on you, but I can wait as long as you need." Nora touched his face, tracing the laugh lines around his eyes. "You've already waited long enough," she whispered. "I love you too." That night, for the first time, Flynn didn't sleep on the floor. As summer gave way to fall, their happiness seemed complete. Sarah took her first tentative steps, toddling from Flynn to Nora with triumphant giggles. The ranch prospered, with Flynn's horses gaining a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far as California. But shadows from the past were drawing closer. One crisp October morning, as Nora hung laundry while Flynn played with Sarah in the yard, riders appeared on the horizon. 5 men, hard-faced and trail-worn, approached the cabin with purpose in their bearing. Flynn stood slowly, positioning himself between the approaching men and his family. "Nora, take Sarah inside," he said quietly. "Who are they?" Nora asked, already gathering the baby in her arms. "Don't know." "But I don't like the look of them." Flynn's hand moved subtly toward the revolver at his hip. The riders stopped a respectful distance from the house. The leader, a scar-faced man with cold eyes, tipped his hat. "Afternoon. This the Barton place?" Flynn nodded, his stance casual but alert. "It is." "I'm Flynn Barton. What can I do for you gentlemen?" The man's eyes shifted to Nora, still visible in the doorway with Sarah. A slow smile spread across his face that made Nora's blood run cold. "Well now, ain't this interesting? We've been tracking a woman and child since spring. Lost the trail near Sawyer's Creek during that big storm." His gaze hardened. "Didn't expect to find her playing house with a rancher." Flynn didn't move, but Nora could see the tension in his shoulders. "My wife and daughter aren't going anywhere with you," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "I suggest you move on," the leader laughed, an ugly sound. "Your wife? That there is Richard Newman's daughter-in-law, carrying his grandchild, the only Newman heir left after Apaches wiped out his son's wagon train," Nora gasped. Thomas's father was alive. He had been estranged from his family for years, had never even mentioned his father to her. But how would these men know that? Richard Newman wants his grandchild, the man continued. Sent us to fetch her. The mother's optional. Flynn's hand now rested openly on his revolver. You're not taking either of them. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Nora could see the other riders subtly positioning themselves, hands hovering near weapons. Flynn, she called, her voice trembling slightly. It's all right, let me talk to them. Stay inside, Nora, Flynn ordered, not taking his eyes off the men. The leader smiled unpleasantly. Smart woman. Listen to her, Barton. Old man Newman is offering $500 for the safe return of his grandchild. You can always get yourself another wife. The insult landed like a physical blow. Flynn's expression hardened. Last warning. Get off my property. The leader's hand moved toward his gun, but Flynn was faster. In one fluid motion, he drew and fired a warning shot into the ground at the leader's horse's feet. The animal reared, nearly unseating its rider. Next one won't miss, Flynn said evenly. Now we're going to talk this through like civilized folks, or you can leave. Your choice. For a moment, it seemed the men would choose violence. Then, surprisingly, the leader laughed and raised his hands in a placating gesture. All right, no need for bloodshed. Let's talk. Flynn nodded toward the barn. We'll talk there, away from my family. As Flynn led the men toward the barn, Nora clutched Sarah tightly, her mind racing. What if these men were telling the truth? What if Thomas's father had rights to Sarah? She had never met the man. Thomas had only spoken of him with bitterness, describing him as cruel and controlling. The minutes stretched endlessly as she waited, jumping at every sound. Finally, after what seemed like hours, she heard the men's horses galloping away. Moments later, Flynn strode back to the house, his expression grim but determined. They're gone, he said, taking Sarah from her arms and holding them both close. For now, what did they want? Was it true about Thomas's father? Flynn guided her to sit at the table, pouring her a cup of water with hands that weren't quite steady. Partly true. Those men aren't working for Richard Newman, they're bounty hunters who heard there might be money in finding his grandchild. But why would Thomas's father want Sarah? He never even knew I was expecting. According to them, Newman's dying, no other heirs, wants to meet his grandchild before he passes. Flynn ran a hand through his hair. But I don't trust them, something's not right. Nora's mind was spinning. What did you tell them? That I'd discuss it with you. That they should tell Newman if he wants to meet his grandchild, he should come himself, not send hired guns. Flynn knelt before her, taking her hands in his. Nora, no matter what, I won't let anyone take Sarah from you, or you from me. We're a family now. The sincerity in his eyes steadied her racing heart. What should we do? Dr. Simmons is riding to Fort Benton tomorrow. I'll send a letter with him to the marshal there, see if we can verify Newman's story. In the meantime, I'll ask some of the ranch hands to stay close. He squeezed her hands. We'll face this together. 2 tense weeks passed. Flynn hired extra hands ostensibly for the fall roundup, but Nora knew it was for protection. She never went outside alone, and Sarah was never out of her sight. Flynn taught her to shoot his spare revolver. She proved a quick study, much to his admiration. Just as they began to hope the threat had passed, a carriage arrived at the ranch, expensive, well-sprung, with a liveried driver. From it emerged an elderly man, thin and stooped, leaning heavily on a cane. His clothes spoke of wealth, but his face was lined with suffering. Flynn met him in the yard, hand near his weapon. Mr. Newman, the old man nodded. Flynn Barton, I received your letter. Thank you for inviting me to meet my granddaughter properly, rather than... He grimaced. I must apologize for those men. I did offer a reward for information about my daughter-in-law and grandchild, but I never authorized anyone to bring them to me by force. Flynn studied him closely, then nodded toward the house. Come inside, sir, but understand this is my family now. I'll protect them with my life if necessary. I would expect nothing less, Newman replied with surprising approval. Inside, Nora waited anxiously, Sarah on her hip. Seeing Thomas's father was a shock. There was something of her late fiancé in the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes. For his part, Richard Newman stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of them, his weathered face crumpling with emotion. "She has his eyes," he whispered, staring at Sarah. Thomas's eyes. The next hours were a revelation. Richard Newman was not the monster Thomas had described. Estranged from his son after a bitter argument years before, he had tried repeatedly to reconcile, only to learn of Thomas's death while his letters were still en route. "I didn't even know he was getting married, much less that I would be a grandfather," he explained, watching Sarah play on the rug. "When I found out, it seemed like a second chance a part of my son still lived." "Those men said you wanted to take Sarah away," Nora said cautiously. Newman shook his head. "I want to know my granddaughter, but I would never separate her from her mother," he looked at Flynn, "or from the man who has clearly been a father to her." Relief washed over Nora. "You don't want custody of her, I want to be part of her life." "I have a large house in St. Louis standing empty, I had thought perhaps." He hesitated. "But I see now you have built a life here, a good life." Flynn and Nora exchanged glances. "Mr. Newman," Flynn said carefully, "we couldn't leave the ranch, but perhaps you might consider staying nearby. Silver Creek is growing, they're even talking about bringing the railroad through next year." The old man's face brightened. "You would allow that, allow me to be part of her life." "She should know her heritage," Nora said softly, "and the good parts of the father she'll never meet." The conversation continued late into the evening, old wounds beginning to heal, new understandings taking root. By the time Newman departed for the hotel in Silver Creek, they had reached an agreement. He would build a small house in town, dividing his time between St. Louis and Arizona territory. Sarah would know her grandfather, and the Barton family would have a powerful ally. That night, as they lay in bed, Sarah sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby, Flynn pulled Nora close. "Are you all right with this arrangement?" he asked, his voice soft in the darkness. Nora nestled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I think it's right for Sarah to know her grandfather, and having him nearby rather than always wondering if he might try to take her away. It feels safer." Flynn kissed the top of her head. "I was afraid he might offer you a better life than I can provide. A grand house in St. Louis, every advantage for Sarah." Nora raised herself on one elbow to look down at him. "Flynn Barton, there is no better life for us than right here with you. You're my husband, Sarah's father, and the man I love. Don't you ever forget that." His smile in the moonlight made her heart skip. "I plan to remind you of that every day for the rest of our lives." 1 year later, on a perfect spring morning, they gathered under the cottonwoods behind the now expanded ranch house. Sarah, sturdy at 2 years old, scattered flower petals with enthusiastic abandon while Richard Newman looked on indulgently. Mrs. Holloway dabbed at her eyes as the minister recited the vows. Though already legally married, Flynn and Nora had decided to renew their vows this time with no hesitation, no reservation, no boundaries between them. When Flynn kissed his bride, their friends and neighbors cheered. "I'd carry you both anywhere," Flynn whispered against her lips, nodding toward where Sarah now sat contentedly in her grandfather's lap. "And I'll never look back." Nora smiled up at the man who had saved her in more ways than one. "We don't need to look back," she said. "Everything I want is right here." As they walked hand in hand toward their future, Nora reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a desperate woman collapsed on a dusty trail to a beloved wife and mother, from a solitary rancher to a devoted husband and father, they had transformed each other's lives in ways neither could have imagined. And it had all begun with a simple act of compassion. A cowboy who had lifted a fallen bride and her unborn child and carried them home.